Okay, welcome back. I realize it's been actually quite a while since I've done a video of me waving my hands in front of a camera, so we're due up for that. What I'm going to talk to you guys today about is how to differentiate if you should be running 4 of a card, 3 of a card, 2 of a card, or 1 of a card. Basically, how many should you run? And there's no clear answer to how many you should run. Really, all I can do is give you some questions that you can ask yourself to help you decide, some guidelines to help you decide, and then ways to identify if a card increases in value, decreases in value, or any of those kind of things. So, diving right in, the first thing that you need to be able to do is you need to be able to identify whether a card gains value as multiple copies come out, maintains a steady, constant value regardless of how many copies are out, or decreases in value as multiple copies come out, or even worse, where any multiple copy just flatlines outright. There's also cards that will just get exponentially better when more come out, but that's really just kind of falling it back into the ballpark of things increasing in value. Currently, I'm just talking about foundations, and also in just the scope of this video, I'm just talking about our staging area kind of in an isolated little world. I'm not going to be talking about like how game state can affect it, or how the card's relationship to other cards can affect its own value. I'm just talking about the value of a card itself, okay? We can get into the other stuff in future videos, but for the simplicity of this one, for all the new people getting into the game with Mortal Kombat's release, I'm just going to leave it at these simple things, okay? So first of all, cards that gain 0 value at multiple copies, or that actually would lose value at multiple copies, or they're straight up dead, okay? And one of the best examples is like a unique card like Damnation. All right, Damnation is incredibly powerful if you run it at 1 copy, because it has a very influential effect when it's on your field. However, if I draw into a second Damnation when I already have 1 Damnation out in field, this card does nothing for me other than being a physical card in my hand, okay? And I don't count that as value in this current state because I need an outside card in order to turn this into value, okay? Playing a second copy of Damnation will just destroy my first copy. It doesn't actually help each other, right? So Damnation is a card where I have to ask myself, do I really want to see this every game? How often do I want to see it? How early do I want to see it? Because the frequency that I want to see a Damnation is only 1. I never want to see more than 1 per game. So just keep that in mind. Damnation's a card that you will see very often run at 1 of in decks, sometimes 2 if the deck wants to go off early and really wants to see this thing every single game. But other than that, you won't see this card played in 3s or 4s very often. And again, any unique card tends to also have that carrying along with it, and also it doesn't have a block. So it doesn't even hold block value sitting in your hand as an additional card, okay? So things to think about. This is a prime candidate of a 1 or 2 of, okay? Another card that doesn't gain a lot of value in multiple copies is Robot Masters. Once again, if you have outside influence helping Robot Masters, you might be able to get more value, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about Robot Masters itself. 4+, your attack gets +1 damage and stun 1, but only playable if your attack's current damage is 4. Robot Masters, again, is fantastic if you get 1 copy out, because it can push your 4 damage attacks to 5 and give them stun. But if I get a second copy and put it into play, the second copy can't trigger if the first copy goes off. The second copy only adds as a safety net to the first one if I check lower than a 4. It gives me a free opportunity to redo the check. So the second copy doesn't add the same amount of board value as the original Robot Masters does. So a second copy actually carries a lower value than the original copy does, okay? It does also have a block on this one, so it does hold value in hand. However, on the field, the second copy has a reduced impact on the game state. So things to think about again. Robot Masters is another card. It can be run at 4 of if the deck has a hard engine for it, but it's typically run around 2, just for the reasons that I've explained. But now let's get into a card where things kind of stay stale across the board, and that's Toasty. This one just came out with Mortal Kombat and the Scorpion starter. Okay, Toasty says E flip, your attack gets +6 damage, X equals the printed desperation rating, and it's playable while it's committed. Toasty is an interesting card because the first copy does its thing, and it doesn't matter if I get a second copy or a third copy or a fourth copy. Each card does its thing independently of the other cards. They don't add value directly to the other cards, and they don't take value away from the other cards. This is just kind of a neutral card. So the decisions that you're going to make as to how many of a Toasty you're going to run is going to depend purely on how much of an impact it has on your deck as a whole or on the other cards that you're running. So you can make those decisions. You don't really have to worry about how it's going to affect each other, right? So this is kind of one of those neutral cards that I was talking about. It doesn't really gain, doesn't really lose. Now looking at cards that can gain value. And the first one I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at My Beautiful Face is Ruined. This is a card that typically, if you can get this thing to function, you want to run this card usually at higher copies. The numbers on it, because it's a 2/4, makes it a little bit harder to slot into decks. However, the Desperation E, this attack is +1 or -1 damage. This is interesting because they all work once they're all triggered, right? So once you get into Desperation, every single copy of My Beautiful Face is Ruined triggers, and every single copy can go off on every single attack. Whereas a card like Toasty, once you use it, it's done and it's gone, and it's only going to apply to one attack. My Beautiful Face is Ruined, they're all going to apply onto every attack you play from that point forward, and they're going to all apply onto every attack your opponent plays from that point forward, right? So they create almost like a floating effect, as long as your opponent can't interact with the enhances, of just increasing or decreasing the damage and potency of attacks as more copies of these come into play. All right. Additionally, it has a response effect after you block with it, so they also carry quite a significant value in hand outside of being in board. So again, now this is a card where it kind of increases in value as you get more copies out, because they all influence each attack, right? So they each add on. So if you're only getting 1 out on 4 attacks, you're getting +4 value, whereas if you get 2 out on 4 attacks, each one is going to apply to each attack, right? Like they all can influence everything. Very great. Going into another one where it's almost even more so is Bridging the Races. Okay, this card gained a lot of popularity during its release, and really until Bebop came out, this card was run quite a lot in a lot of competitive decks, because it carries such great value the more copies you gain out, you can get out, and it's kind of based around this response. So E commit, your kick, punch, or slam attack gets +1/+1. That's already really strong or really good for a 1/4, and it's a 2+ mid block. What's amazing about this card is the response. Once per turn, after a card is either removed or added to your staging area during the combat phase, you can ready this foundation, playable while committed. The reason why it's so fantastic is that if I get a second copy out of Bridging the Races, the responses both piggyback on the same response window. Okay, so now instead of, if I only have 1 out and I add another foundation to my staging area while this is committed, the single copy will ready, and then I can play the effect again on a different attack. However, if I have 2 of them out and another card comes into play when they're there, they both get to trigger off the same instance. And then if on my opponent's turn, after I've used them, I can pull one, they both again trigger on the same response. So it's not like I need to try to find a way to enter a card per Bridging the Races. They don't hold a neutral value. They all can jump on the same window. So therefore I'm getting more effects triggering off of one window. Okay? That's where these cards get really powerful, is that they're all kind of piggybacking on single instances. So if you're playing a deck that revolves around trying to get these instances to go off, you're getting more effects per response window, is basically what I'm trying to get at, right? So this is a card, again, it's got a good block on it, it's got really good numbers on it. This is a card you see almost always run at 4 of in decks that can run it, because it's so great. If you can get if you can add cards to your staging area or pull cards out through destroy effects or through whatever, again, all these cards are just going to trigger. So as the game progresses and as you get more copies out in the field, each action that you perform during your turn impacts more of your board and has a greater effect on the game state, right? Are you following along at this point? So that's just foundations, okay? Those are just some things to think about with foundations. When you get into attacks, or even, I guess, actions, and kind of carry the same thing. Oh yeah, so like assets will follow the same sort of rules as foundations will, but a little bit less, because obviously they're assets and you can't commit them to pass checks, so they normally don't have that much value, or they normally have very unique effects and just don't usually gain value as you get multiple copies, because you can't commit them to pass checks anyways, and you don't want to clog with them. But that's something else. With attacks are slightly different, because attacks you do still have increasing value and decreasing value, but it's a little bit different. With an attack, you have to ask yourself different questions. You have to ask yourself, do I want to see it early? Do I want to see it often? Does it gain value in pairs? Does it lose value in pairs? Does my deck rely on it? Like, is it an engine card? Is it specific? Do I need to see this every game? Or if I never see this attack, what does that do for my game? Okay, these are things you need to ask yourself with every attack, okay? Some attacks get better in pairs, some attacks don't get better in pairs. Some attacks are really terrible when you find them, if you pull 2 of them at the same time. You only ever want to see one, and they just kind of complement the other attacks in your string, okay? And I'm gonna give you some examples. All right, so Sun God Choke another new card that came out with Mortal Kombat. I love this card. It's one of my personal favorites. This is an example of a card that if you draw it in pairs, it complements itself. Okay, so Sun God Choke says when this card's added to your momentum, you add it face up. E momentum, you can remove it. Your attack with a printed damage of 3 or less gets +5 damage. And then E lose 2 vitality after this attack resolves, you can add it to your momentum. Now, this is a card where, yeah, if I draw it in pairs, it can feed each other. So if I play the first one, play that enhance, lose 2 vitality, add it to my momentum, and then I play the second copy, I can use the first copy to fuel the second copy, adding 5 damage to this one, right? Making it a 5 high for 8. That can still then, again, enhance, add itself in, and even if I drew a third Sun God Choke, they can keep fueling each other in that manner, right? Regardless of how many Sun God Chokes I find in my hand, I can always play them, and each one will previously feed the next one. So this is a card that will maintain and gain value in multiple copies. Okay, an example of a card that doesn't really gain value but doesn't lose value in multiple copies is a card like Takedown. And these are utility cards where the effects on them don't directly influence another attack of its kind, but it's still a really strong attack in and of itself, just based on its numbers. So like, I wouldn't be sad if I saw multiple copies of it, but they don't exactly feed into the next copy of itself, but they don't take away from the next copy of itself either. So this kind of goes back to the foundation, same thing. If it's a neutral card like this, you kind of have to ask yourself other questions. How does it affect the rest of my deck? Is it something that I need? Does it add blocks that I need? Those kind of questions. You can start asking yourself that in determining how many of a card you need to run. So this is an example of more of a neutral value card in multiple copies. And then looking at a card that doesn't, I wouldn't say gain, like it's not really neutral, and it's more of a negative effect the more copies you get out. Okay, if I draw into a hand of 2 from Hells, okay, especially depending on the stage of the game that I'm at, like in early game especially, this is really poor because it's a 6 difficulty, which is already hard enough to play, because if I check a 3 on that, I have to commit 3, and if I get 2 copies of From Hell in my hand, going from one From Hell into another From Hell is very difficult, because that's a very high difficulty string. And then if I saw a third one, it's even more difficult. The only time that I might want to see that is late game, when I know they can't block. Then it's great, because I'm just closing out a game with From Hells. But this goes back into those questions where it's, do I want to see it early? Not really. Do I want to see it often? Not really. I want to see it in the late game, and I want it there when I need it. But I don't want to see it early. I don't want to see it often. I don't typically want to see it in pairs unless it's late game. Especially not early game, I don't want to see it in pairs. Right? Does it gain value in pairs? Only if I'm in late game and I can't block. This is a very niche situation, right? And I said I wasn't going to try to get into like weird, game state things, but with this I kind of have to. Another thing about From Hell is that it has an EX3 on it. So because momentum's a limited resource, I can't put the same amount of momentum on each one, right? If I only have one momentum, I can't put one on each. It's like one or the other. These are finisher cards. And finisher cards, typically, you don't want to have tons of them unless it's like a linchpin in your deck where you need to have this card. This is the only way you can close out a game. However, if you have a card like that or a deck build like that, then that's typically poor design. You don't usually want to put all your eggs in one basket, because again, like I mentioned earlier, you got to ask yourself, how does the game change if all I see is this attack? How does the game change if I never see this attack? These are just questions you need to ask yourself when you're picking numbers and cards, right? So going back through our pile that we just went through, let's go backwards here. So Damnation is a card where I would run 1 to 2 copies in a deck. I would run 2 copies if I'm running a very aggressive deck that I don't plan on getting past turn 3 very often. So I might run 2 copies then, just to increase my likelihood of seeing one. And because I'm only planning on playing a game for about 3 turns, I don't ever expect to really see the second copy that often, right? I'm running low. I'm just running my percentages and hoping for the best there. I'm hoping that the value of seeing Damnation more often will outweigh the odds of ever seeing a second copy. So that's how I would do it. Typically, if I'm in a regular kind of a standard build, I'd run 1 copy, because it adds a ton of value to the board when it comes out into play, but the second copy doesn't add any. Next up, we have Robot Masters. This is a card where I run 2 to 3 copies, if without any outside influence. It's very strong, and the second copy adds kind of a safety net. So if I ever do see a second copy of Robot Masters, it's just a safety net for the first copy, and it just helps me ensure that I get that effect off on the attacks that it can proc on. If I see a third copy, it's again just going to be more of a safety net, and then a little bit if they try to target these down or stun them, again, it's just a safety net, and that's what they become. Each one kind of is an additional layer to the first one. So this is a good example of a card where you run between 2 to 3 on a normal deck. If you have a way to support or engine this card or reduce your attacks back down to keep giving them stun, different situation. All right, Toasty. This is a card where it's going to be entirely dependent on my deck design. If I'm playing Scorpion, whose entire attack lineup is Desperation, then you're more inclined to want to run more than this. Especially if you're running the Desperation 4 stuff, then this card just turns into +4 damage. However, if you're running cards with lower Desperation, then you're not going to, right? Like I said, multiple copies aren't going to dictate how good this card is. The reason that you're going to run more copies of this is if you're lacking damage in your deck. So if you need damage in your deck, this is a great card that you can just stick in to increase those numbers, especially if you have throws with Desperation. So this card ends up being chosen with its numbers independent of itself and how many of this you run. You can just add more of them based on your needs. Then going to cards like My Beautiful Face is Ruined and Bridging the Races. Beautiful Face I almost always run between 3 and 4 if I can fit it, and I only really cut the 4th copy if I'm really struggling for deck space and something just beats it out in value. Whereas Bridging the Races is almost always a 4 of spam in decks that can run it, that run the Kick, Punch, Slam package, and that have any sort of ability to destroy cards in their own staging area or add cards to their staging area, however it is, because they just all trigger off that same window. Absolutely brilliant card. And a really good example of just increasing value with multiple copies. Going to the attacks. Sun God Choke. It is a 5 difficulty attack. However, like I said, each one can clear itself. So as long as you're able to pay the cost on this is a card that you can very easily run at 3 or 4 copies. If you have other cards that proc into, or that have a damage of 3 or less, or depending on your deck design again, you can accommodate your numbers from that point on. But naturally, on its own, this card can easily be run with 3 to 4 copies. Because it does have a self-fueling effect. If I see multiple versions of it, or multiple copies of it, each one feeds into the next one. Going into Takedown, another independent card. So this again, I'm going to choose this card based on the needs of my deck. This card is a low attack and has a low block, so if I'm struggling with low blocks, it's very easy to put 4 of this card into my deck. It also has a draw effect if your opponent can't block it. So if your deck is missing card draw or just needs a little bit more of an aggressive push to see those attacks, this is another great card to add to your deck. But again, notice how all the decisions I'm making around how many of this card I'm running are going to be independent of how many of them I run and more about what my deck needs. And then lastly, finishers like From Hell. This is a card where you're typically going to run it around 2 copies just because it's a brilliant finisher and I'm usually going to want to see it when I want to see it. But until then, I don't want to see it. I don't want to see this card early. I don't want to see it that often unless my deck accommodates for this card. Unless my deck is completely relying on this card, then I can run it at 4 copies if I'm designing my deck around a certain feature card like this. All right. Otherwise, it's going to be running lower sets. You can see this card as a hot one of in lots of decks because if your opponent's not preparing for it, you can catch them off guard with it. But if you're running 4x of something like this, your opponent's going to be more inclined to hold high blocks to make sure that they're not going to get hit with these From Hells, or they're going to be more inclined to control your speed with your momentum or those kind of things. So anyways, this was just a bit of a primer so that you have some questions you can ask yourself while you're deck building for those people that are now like getting into UFS, or maybe just people who struggle with deck building. Just some of the questions that I go through or some of the things I think about when I'm looking at how many copies of a card I'm going to be running. So I don't know, hopefully this helped, and I hope you enjoyed another video of me waving my hands around because I really haven't done enough of these.